If you want to get coached by me, click the link in the description and join my community Discord server. I'm Royal, and in this video I will be showing you 5 new broken builds from the Chinese server on patch 4.2a. Let's jump straight into it. First up, we have roaming Deadman's Plate Galio mid. You rush Deadman's Plate and boots with the Glory enchant, while also abusing the Pathfinder rune to roam. Galio has very good engages with his third ability and AoE taunt, while his global ultimate, which just got buffed, makes his roaming even better. This build is best with a carry jungler cause you can set up plays for them and they can do the damage. For the rest of your build, you will go into an AP build with Morellonomicon, Crystalline Reflector, Oblivion Orb, and lastly Death Cap. For your runes, you will take Aftershock, Weakness, Second Wind, and of course Pathfinder. The whole point of this build is roaming. You can clear mid lane quickly with your first ability and passive, then you can roam to the side lanes or the jungle. In laning phase, you just want to play safe and farm up. Try to set up ganks for your jungler if possible by holding the wave near your turret. Galio has very strong gank setup. Once you get your deadmans, you should quickly clear the wave with your first ability and passive and instantly roam. Look for playing the side lanes or invade with your jungler. In the mid game, you want to continue to roam and catch enemies out of position. You run at them extremely fast with Deadman's Plate and Glorious enchant. Make sure you're playing with your jungler and support to set up these plays. You usually won't have enough damage to finish off targets alone. Next up, we have Rylai's Frozen Heart tanky Swain. This build is insane versus slow mobility teams. Using the constant slow from Rylai's, you can keep enemies in your ult and infinitely sustain with your crazy healing while they struggle to do damage versus Frozen Heart. You don't build a mana item and rush Rylai's. Then, you pick up your Frozen Heart and the Gargoyles enchant to avoid getting bursted in teamfights. Next, you will go for Riftmaker and Amaranth's Twin Guard. Once you survive the initial burst and stack Riftmaker and Twin Guard, you will be unkillable while the enemies struggle to escape the Rylai slow. Lastly, you can take Liandry's or even Spirit Visage if the enemies have a lot of magic damage. For your runes, you will take Conqueror, which works great with this playstyle. Weakness, since you're constantly AoE slowing everyone with Rylai's. Perseverance for Tenacity, or go Adaptive Carnage if the enemies don't have a lot of CC. Finally, Mana Flow Bend to make up for the low mana in the early game. In the early game, you just want to farm up and wave clear with your first ability. You don't have a lot of kill pressure unless your enemies make big mistakes. Once you get your ultimate and Rylai's, you're very strong. Try to play with your team and look for team fights. The constant Rylai slow from your ultimate and your healing and tankiness will make you impossible to kill. If the enemies don't have the mobility to get out of your Rylai slow, there is no counterplay. They can't kill you because you're too tanky and have too much sustain, and they will slowly die to your ultimate and first ability spam. With the recent buffs to Pike, he's becoming a huge threat in the mid lane and jungle. A top Chinese Pike builds him with Trinity Force. The recent buffs to his armor and magic resist make him a little bulkier so he can stay in fights longer and utilize the attack speed from Trinity Force, instead of instantly running if you can't one-shot. You start off your build with Yomu's for the roaming power, then you build Trinity Force. Next up, take Serpent's Fang versus a lot of shields or Duskblade if they don't have any shields. Finish up your build with Sherilda's Grudge and Edge of Night or Guardian Angel. For runes, you're gonna take Electrocute, Sudden Impact, Second Wind, and Pathfinder. In the early game, you want to look for your combos on your enemy laner and pick up solo kills, but try not to get poked down too hard. Whenever you're able to push out the mid-wave, roam. Pike excels at roaming. If you're playing him in a jungle, you of course should be farming your camps, but you can be more aggressive than the usual jungler and look for early ganks, because even if they dodge your stun, you can still hook them into your team. Pike is very strong in the mid game, so roam around and look for picks on caught out enemies. In teamfights, don't go in first. Look for hooks on caught out enemies, and once someone is low, you can get your ultimate resets and clean up the fight. Moving on, we have another Trinity Force build, and this time it's Mundo. So this Mundo build comes directly from the rank 1 Mundo in China. This build can be played both in the jungle and the Baron lane. He mostly plays in jungle though. He starts off his build with Trinity Force to make his clear absurdly fast and add a lot of damage to a very tanky champion. The movement speed bonuses from Trinity Force also help him stick to his target so it's harder to kite him. Additionally, he's gonna take the Glorious enchant to make it even harder to get kited. He pretty much takes the one big weakness that Mundo has, his lack of mobility, and makes up for it with this build. After Trinity Force, he will of course build Mundo's core item, Spirit Visage. Then he will take Sunfire and Thorn Mail. Often he will build Thorn Mail before Sunfire if the enemies have a lot of AD and healing. Lastly, he will take Twin Guard. For runes, you want to go Conqueror in the jungle and Grasp in the Baron lane. Then take Triumph, Perseverance, and Transcendence. Make sure you're taking Ghost instead of Flash, and if you're playing Baron lane, take Ignite instead of Smite. In the early game, you just want to farm up and only go for easy ganks and trades. You just want to scale to your first item. Once you get Trinity Force and Glory Enchant, you can run into the enemy champions and stat check them. Your dueling is very strong at this point. In the mid to late game, you want to play more as a bruiser and not as a tank. Your damage is very high, but if you're not careful, the enemy team can burst you down. When you're full build, you're pretty much a raid boss and impossible to stop. You're gonna be too tanky and dealing too much damage while also being very fast. Speaking of raid boss champions, lastly we have Nasus with Phase Rush. Nasus is a complete raid boss in the late game, but he's very easy to kite with slows and stuns. Phase Rush, an Iceborne Gauntlet with a heavy tenacity build, takes away that weakness, and you can sprint at the enemy carries and one-tap them with your stacks one by one. So for the build, you want to rush Iceborne Gauntlet and the tier item Winter's Approach. Then pick up your Twin Guard and Spirit Visage. For your last item, you can pick up Thornmail or Force of Nature. For runes, we will of course go Phase Rush, Weakness or Giant Slayer, Perseverance versus a lot of CC, or Second Wind versus Poke, and finally Demolish. In the early game, you just want to AFK farm and stack your first ability as much as possible. Once you get your Iceborne Gauntlet, you can look to fight a lot more with your ultimate. If you manage to survive in the early game and mid game, no champion should ever be able to stop you at 3 items. You can use your slow to catch up to enemies, and once you start hitting them and proc your Phase Rush, it's impossible for them to escape. At this point, you will feel extremely strong, but make sure you aren't overestimating your own abilities and running into 5 enemies by yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're interested in more content like this, comment below. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe for more Wild Rift content.